What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you my top 5 meta decks for the August 2019 format. Now, we have a ton of big tournaments coming up. We have the UDS in Indianapolis, we have YCS Portland not too far after that, and we also have the Pro Play Tour event in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on August 17th and 18th. A $2,000 cash prize pool is up for grabs and only 20 bucks to enter. I'll also be there doing live commentary coverage for the event, so check out the links below if you want to attend. So this video is going to be bringing you guys what I feel are going to be the strongest decks going into this format. Keep in mind, while they are numerically ranked, and I do feel that there is some validity to that ranking, these decks are so close together in power level that realistically, any one of these could still be number one. And honestly, we are in an open metagame. People are still trying to figure things out after the July 2019 ban list, so there is a little bit of fluctuation going on, and I'll be sure to bring you guys updates after each event so you guys know how the meta keeps evolving. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So kicking things off with number 5, I'm actually going to go ahead and give a shout out to all the rogue players out there who are still sticking to their tried and true decks of stuff like Subterra Guru, True Draco, and I even have stuff like Salamangreat down here as well. Now, all of these decks are still perfectly viable options, and while they may be at the bottom of this list, you know, they still have a pretty good chance at topping. We just had a card market event take place in this past weekend, and honestly, all these decks were in attendance. These decks actually took up a significant portion of the overall representation, which you can check out my meta analysis if you want to see that. But then most of these decks actually had at least one deck in the top cut as well, just giving you rogue players some hope that there is actually the potential for you to play something that may not strictly be a meta deck, but these rogue decks may be able to move up the ladder a little bit now that the other decks have been, you know, kind of hit on the ban list to a minor extent, just kind of pushing these decks together and creating a much more diverse format. Now, everyone may not like a more diverse format, but honestly, I think that's where Yu-Gi-Oh's at its best, where there's like 10 different decks that everyone can play, and I think that's what makes Yu-Gi-Oh so great. But moving on to number 4, we have a deck that a lot of people have high hopes for going into this format, and that's Pendulum Magician. Pendulum Magician just can really do it all, right? I mean, it has the ability to pump out insanely powerful turn 1 boards. Even going second, it actually does a fairly decent job at breaking boards because it has some really nice, unique tools that other decks don't have access to. I mean, you have the pendulum summoning mechanic. You've got stuff like all the Magician engine, which has just a lot of very unique interactions when you have stuff like Dragon Pit Magician and Purple Poison Magician. Pendulum Magician is just slated as a seriously strong contender. It was one of the strongest decks in last format in the tier 2-ish category, and again, it suffered no hits on the last ban list. I think a lot of people had really high hopes for this deck, myself included, going into this format. I think the first series of tournaments that we've seen have shown that Pendulum Magician is not without its weaknesses. Obviously, it is very susceptible to different types of disruption. However, that doesn't mean the deck isn't extremely powerful, and I honestly think it's definitely worthy of that number 4 slot. Now, coming in at number 3, we have a deck that a lot of people actually underestimated for this format just due to the changes on the most recent ban list, and that deck is Orcust. Now, when it comes to Orcust, a lot of people were fearing that because of the fact that Rusty Bardiche was hit, the deck wasn't going to be able to pump out the insane turn 1 boards that it was able to previously. And while that may be true, the deck has had time to evolve, and players have gotten the chance to experiment and figure out the new evolution of Orcust. And what's interesting is that Orcust actually has a much wider array of different deck types than you might expect. There's a more combo style variant that we've been seeing that can take advantage of stuff like the Guardragon engine, surprisingly, and being able to access the Guardragon engine just means you can further solidify your board with just more negations, kind of like similar to what Orcust was able to do, but obviously you're taking advantage of the Guardragon engine and using different cards to do so. We see this with cards that are able to access, you know, Ib the World Chalice Justiciar, and just be able to go into these extremely powerful turn 1 boards that are very reminiscent of the old school Orcust days. Even if you don't go that route, Orcust is still able to pump out something like a Topologic Bomber Dragon with an Orcust Babel and an Orcust Dingirsu in the graveyard, as well as Symbol Skeleton, which means you can effectively like nuke the board like once if not twice if you have another Orcust in there, and it's a really, really difficult thing for your opponent to play through when their board is just getting nuked multiple times in a turn. You could also have that backed by other cards as well. But then there's also the control style element to Orcust too, which is playing a ton of hand traps and just playing cards that can facilitate doing a standard, more traditional Orcust combo, which may just end on something like with Galatea and maybe like Crescendo, maybe Babel set to be able to disrupt them with Dingirsu, or maybe something with Long Girsu beyond that, and then you just have a bunch of disruption in the form of something like hand traps, or maybe even some stuff like Solemn Judgment too, who knows. I think Orcust has a lot of of different varieties right now, and players are trying to experiment to figure out what the best variant is. I mean, we saw even a Lunalight variant top the card market event that took place last weekend too, so that goes just to show another different element that you can incorporate into your Orcust strategy to give it some diversity and just kind of see what works depending on whatever metagame you need to tailor the deck for. I definitely think Orcust is here to stay, and that's why I went ahead and gave it my number 3 slot. But coming in at number 2, if we're gonna talk combo decks, then we need to discuss the absolute king when it comes to combo decks and turn 1 boards when it's this format or any format leading up to this, Crusadia Danger Thunder Guardragon. Yes, that is the full-length title of this Titanic deck, and it honestly is very worthy of that long title because this deck is very, very scary. A lot of you guys might have thought this would have been my number 1 deck, but there is just one other deck that does outclass it. However, that does not mean you should underestimate this deck. This deck had the highest representation of the tournaments of this past weekend, and again, things can change. We are in an open metagame, but this deck, while it did suffer some hits with White Dragon, Wyvern Burster, and Black Dragon Collapse Serpent going to 1, Eclipse Wyvern being banned, different things like that, didn't really hurt the deck too much, and that's because the Guardragon engine is still so easy to facilitate, and this deck is probably one of the easiest ways to turbo out the Guardragons and be able to just set up an incredibly powerful board with Hot Red Dragon, Archfiend Abyss, your Heavenly Spheres, and then you also have it backed by stuff like Thunder Dragon Colossus, you've got Chaos Dragon Levianeer, and Darkest Diabolos to rip cards out of your opponent's hand. Like, this deck is insane. It's got so many ways to play through disruption, it's got plenty of extenders if it does get disrupted, and can usually end on a board of 2 to 3 negations regardless of what it's going up against. And even if it's going second, it can easily push through boards just because of the fact that it can throw its resources out so efficiently and just be able to break apart those boards with the massive amount of advantage that this deck can generate. This deck is no joke. Do not underestimate this deck because this deck is going to be played in mass. This might have some of the highest representation of the overall field of a tournament, which means you have the highest likelihood of playing against this deck. You need to be prepared for it. And like I said, while it may not be number 1 on this particular list, it's very, very close. And honestly, this could easily be the most dominant deck of the format. I just think people are already prepared for that and might be already side decking or even main decking accordingly just to prepare for it. So that's why I went ahead and gave this deck my number 2 slot. Now, before we get to my number 1 deck, I did have one honorable mention, and that is any sort of TCG variant of a Dragon Link deck. Now, Dragon Link is actually one of the strongest decks currently in the OCG, and granted, our formats are completely different because their card pool right now, especially relative to the ban list, is vastly different. However, Dragon Link is still something that we might see. It's actually a deck that actually saw a first place finish at a VIP YCS event for YCS Portland, and in a format that's still relatively undefined, not to mention we get the Rocket Structure deck a little bit later this week. Who knows? This could be a deck that is actually very powerful. This deck is able to amass some pretty scary turn 1 boards, very similar to stuff like the Crusadia Danger Thunder Guardragon. We have stuff like Pendulum Magician. This deck is very similar, and again, it may have its choke points because it does take advantage of the Guardragon engine, and it has its weaknesses. However, it's another strong combo deck, and honestly, because of the way the deck's designed, you could even play this combo deck with hand traps in it. And I want to put it in the honorable mentions because I don't exactly know where it's going to fit, but it's something to definitely be cognizant of because you might see it at some tournaments in this upcoming format. But that's going to bring us to my number 1 meta deck of the August 2019 format, and if you haven't already figured it out, I'm giving it to Sky Striker. Yes, even with Sky Striker having multi-roll go to 1, I honestly have to put this at the number 1 category because based off of the tournament results we've seen so far, Sky Striker has some of the highest representation in the overall field of these tournaments, and not to mention its conversion rate going into top cut is insane. And the thing is, Sky Striker has proven itself over the past year and a half now that it is able to do this regardless of what stands in its way. It doesn't care if it has 1 multi-roll, it doesn't care if it has 1 Kagari. We are seeing this deck adapt, and Sky Striker is able to adapt to any different format, but also play a lot of unique cards that some other decks cannot play. I mean, we're seeing people play Card of Demise now just to help turbo out and get to their cards necessary to be able to actually play against some of these crazy combo decks. This deck can incorporate Mystic Mine, which it's one of the few decks that can actually play very well under Mystic Mine, and also just facilitates the rest of the deck because of the spell count. You can break out of your own Mystic Mine at any time with something like the deck's inherent field spell. There's just so many positives when it comes to this deck, and the fact that it just has a crazy conversion rate from going to its overall overall population at a tournament to the top cut, just being able to dominate. I mean, we saw at the card market event, it was a Sky Striker mirror match, and 5 of the top 16, I think, were Sky Striker, maybe even more than that. Yeah, Sky Striker is definitely going to be the deck to beat. Like I said, it's still very close on this list when you're looking at what the best decks are, because Crusadia, Danger Thunder, Guardragon is not really far behind, and Orcust probably isn't too far behind that. But when you're looking at the raw numbers, Sky Striker's got it, and that's why I gave Sky Striker my number 1 slot. So guys, that's going to go ahead and do it. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video helpful, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. Because just by showing your support in any way that you can, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.